My mother she would give us a hard time sometimes, and she would say to us, I don't know what's wrong with you young people. You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
Hello, genealogy explorers. Get ready to dive into the intriguing layers of Kamala Harris's ancestry, where the complexities of historical, racial classifications intertwine with her personal story. This video, however, isn't about who to vote for or why you should like Kamala Harris. Those aren't the talking points here, okay? If you have extreme views on her or politics, please take them elsewhere. Instead, we'll focus on how racial classifications have shaped perceptions and influenced her role in today's political and social landscape. I'll be aiming for complete neutrality and unbiased insight because understanding these themes is crucial. So grab a bag of popcorn. Things are about to get messy, child. Racial classifications in early America were not mere bureaucratic labels, but instruments designed to enforce social hierarchies and facilitate exploitation. These classifications were essential in codifying the roles and rights of individuals within colonial and early American societies. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the burgeoning system of racial categorization aimed to justify and institutionalize the enslavement of Africans and the marginalization of indigenous peoples. Africans forcibly brought to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade were broadly categorized as Negro, a term that stripped them of their diverse ethnic identities and reduced them to a monolithic category. This reductionist approach served to justify their exploitation and maintain a system of racial oppression. Simultaneously, indigenous peoples were similarly marginalized. Their identities often amalgamated into broad racial categories that facilitated their displacement and subjugation. The colonial and early American legal systems crafted these categories to support the economic and social structures that relied on racial hierarchies. As we've discussed on this channel before, we know the numbers around the transatlantic slave trade aren't precise, but I'm going to give you the full context of the figures commonly cited. So before anyone rushes to the comments to point out inaccuracies, just know we're aware, okay? My goal is to keep this video as unbiased as possible, and I'll be presenting a comprehensive overview of the numbers related to the transatlantic slave trade. Let's be clear, I'm not one of those YouTubers who denies that Africans came to the Americas. In fact, I've seen documentation from people's own ancestries showing African roots. We're going with logic over emotions here, alright? Good. Now let's get to it. The transatlantic slave trade was a brutal chapter in history, forcibly bringing an estimated 12.5 million Africans to the Americas, with about 10.7 million surviving the brutal Middle Passage. In the United States alone, only 388,000 Africans were imported between 1619 and 1865. This massive influx of enslaved Africans was a key factor in solidifying racial classifications and justifying slavery. Africans were often stripped of their cultural identities and languages upon arrival, reduced to a single racial category that facilitated their enslavement and dehumanization. This process of reduction and classification was essential for upholding the social and economic systems that thrived on their exploitation. In Jack D. Forbes' insightful article. The use of the terms Negro and Black to include persons of Native American ancestry in Anglo North America, we uncover how the rigid racial categories of colonial America led to the misclassification of American Indians as Negroes or Blacks. This practice was more than a mere bureaucratic error. It was deeply embedded in the efforts to enforce social hierarchies and justify marginalization. Forbes provided compelling examples of how misclassification was widespread. In colonial Virginia, many American Indians were recorded as Negroes in legal documents and census. This categorization was not incidental, but a strategic move to fit individuals into a binary racial system that supported the societal and economic structures of that time. Similarly, in the Spanish colonies, such as Florida and New Mexico, the term Negro was often applied to American Indians. This usage was part of a broader pattern where racial classifications were used to denote individuals who were not of European descent, irrespective of their actual ethnic backgrounds. This was particularly evident in contexts involving labor and servitude, where the emphasis was on maintaining control and order rather than accurately representing diverse identities. The article also highlights a significant royal decree from Brazil in 1755, which sought to address the misuse of the term Negro for American Indians. The decree acknowledged that this term was being used derogatorily and sought to rectify this practice by formally prohibiting the use of Negro to describe indigenous peoples. This was a critical step in recognizing and correcting the flawed racial categorizations of the time. Forbes' analysis sheds light on how the historical practices of racial misclassification contributed to the broader system of racial categorization, highlighting the need to understand and address the complexities of race and identity in early American history. Bacon's Rebellion of 1676 in Virginia marked a turning point in the racial classifications used in colonial America. The rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon was triggered by disputes over land with American Indians. The rebellion exposed the potential for alliances between poor whites and indigenous peoples, which alarmed colonial authorities. In response, Virginia's lawmakers enacted laws that entrenched racial divisions to prevent future alliances that could threaten the colonial status quo. The legal distinction between white and black inhabitants became more pronounced following the rebellion. To reinforce these divisions, Virginia passed two critical acts in November 1682 that combined Native Americans and Africans into a single racial category, Negroes and other slaves. These acts decreed that all non-Christian servants, including Native Americans and Africans, were to be considered slaves. This legal framework was a deliberate attempt to solidify racial hierarchies and prevent the possibility of alliances that could challenge the colonial power structure. The classification aimed to ensure that poor whites were given new rights and status, thereby creating a divide between them and those categorized as black. Kamala Harris's political career reflects the intersection of her diverse heritage with contemporary issues of identity and representation. As the first female Vice President of the United States and a former Attorney General of California, her career has drawn both praise and criticism, reflecting broader debates about race, justice, and policy efficiency.
Do you support reparations for Black people?
Well, listen, again, we had over 200 years of slavery. We had Jim Crow for almost a century. We had
legalized discrimination and segregation, and now we have segregation and discrimination that is not legal but still exists and is a barrier to progress. We have disparities around housing. We have disparities around education. We have disparities around income. And we have to recognize that everybody did not start out on an equal footing in this country. And in particular, black people have not. And so we have got to recognize that and do something about that and give folks a lift up. That's why, for example, I'm proposing the LIFT Act. Give people who are making $100,000 or less as a family a tax credit, which will benefit and uplift 60% of black families who are in poverty.
So by default, it affects black families, but there's not a particular policy for African Americans that you would explore.
But no, if you look at the reality of who will benefit from certain policies, when you take into account that they're not starting at the same place and they're not starting on equal footing, it will directly benefit black children, black families, black homeowners, because the disparities are so significant. So if we focus on the specific issues that have resulted in the greatest disparities, and we understand that that's part of why we're doing it. Listen, the reality also is this. Any policy that will benefit black people will benefit all of society. Let's be clear about that. Let's really be clear about that. So I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do something that's only going to benefit black people. No, because whatever benefits that black family will benefit that community and society as a whole in the country, right?
Harris's political career has also been a focal point in discussions about racial representation and identity.
Becoming the first Indian American woman to be nominated as a vice presidential candidate in America.
I stand before you as the first candidate for Vice President of the United States of South Asian descent. When my mother, Kamala, stepped off the plane in California at 19 years old, she didn't have much in the way of belongings. But she carried with her lessons from back home. Growing up, my mother would take my sister, Maya, and me back to what was then called Madras, because she wanted us to understand where she had come from.
Her diverse heritage, including African and East Indian ancestry, intersects with the debates about racial identity and political authenticity. Harris's father, Donald Harris, is of mixed heritage with his roots in Jamaica. While he has African ancestry, he is also of biracial background with European ancestry as well. This complexity in Harris's background often influences perceptions of her identity and political representation. The one-drop rule continues to shape discussions about racial identity, asserting that any African ancestry classifies an individual as black. This rule, deeply entrenched in historical racism, often overshadows the nuanced and diverse backgrounds of individuals with African ancestry. For many, this rule simplifies complex identities into rigid categories, impacting how figures like Harris are perceived and categorized. Harris's identity as a multiracial woman highlights broader issues of representation in American politics. Despite her African and East Indian heritage, some Black Americans feel unrepresented by presidential candidates.
They're like, how could you call her by her first name? She's worked so hard. Okay, so what we're going to cook today is an Indian recipe.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
you are Indian.
Yes.
Okay, and I don't know that everybody knows that, but I find that wherever I go and I see Indian people at the supermarket, on the street, everyone's like, you know, Kamala Harris is Indian, right? It's like our thing we're so excited about to have you running for president.
Yeah.
So we're both Indian,
Yes.
but actually we're both South Indian.
Yes.
Has decided to hit up the Breakfast Club and really open up to Charlamagne and the crew. Kamala specifically addressed her critics who have been questioning her blackness due to the fact that her parents were immigrants born in India and Jamaica. She spent her high school years in Canada and because she's married to a white man. Here's what Kamala had to say.
They're trying to do what has been happening over the last 2 years, which is powerful voices trying to sow hate and division among us. Mm-hmm. And so we need to recognize when we're being played. But I'm black, and I'm proud of being black. Absolutely. And I was born black, I will die black. And I'm proud of it. And I'm not going to make any excuses for anybody.
This sentiment is rooted in the historical context that has often excluded Black Americans or those with complex ancestries from political prominence. The feeling of exclusion is compounded by the perception that candidates with African ancestry, but not from the United States like Harris, may not fully represent the experiences and identities of Black Americans with deep-rooted connections to the United States. The lack of representation for Black Americans with long-standing ties to the U.S. as well as for individuals with indigenous American heritage, can feel exclusionary and dismissive of their unique historical and cultural contributions. This oversight may stem from a range of factors, including historical biases and the oversimplification of racial and ethnic identities. Furthermore, this trend underscores a troubling narrative that seems to prioritize foreign ancestry over the rich, complex histories of those who have long been part of the American fabric. It raises a thought provoking question. Is there a subtle preference for leaders with more foreign connections and ancestry rather than those who embody the deep generational roots in American soil? Such dynamics not only affect political representation, but also influence national conversations about identity and belonging. It's crucial to recognize and address these disparities to ensure a more inclusive and representative political landscape that honors the diverse experiences and histories of all Americans. The prevailing political and social frameworks often force individuals like Harris into singular racial categories, overshadowing their multifaceted identities. Harris's heritage, her father's mixed racial background, and her mother's East Indian ancestry places her in a unique position. Yet, the dominant narratives in American politics frequently view her through a simplified racial lens. This tendency to reduce complex identities to one dimensional categories can be isolating and unfair, reflecting ongoing challenges and addressing the full scope of diverse backgrounds and political representation. Understanding these historical and contemporary dynamics is essential for a nuanced view of Harris's identity and political impact. The legacy of racial classifications continue to shape perceptions and policies, highlighting the ongoing need for a more inclusive and comprehensive approach to identity and representation in American politics.
You see a lot when you're the firstborn. I saw my mother and how she worked hard and she was full of pride and would never want anyone to ever pity her. She never complained about anything. But I also knew how she suffered. I knew how she stayed up late at night trying to figure things out. She was a brown woman with an accent. I remember going into a store and us being followed. I remember how people would look at my mother and make certain assumptions about her intelligence or her capacity or her right to belong. As the eldest child, you see this. My mother was very well aware that she was raising two black girls to be two black women. And she did that instilling in us pride in our culture and cultures, always knowing that we would face all kinds of obstacles. But you see a lot when you're the firstborn.